Hello. Today we want to investigate something of what God's Bible says about our lives and about what He wants to do in our lives and how we can relate to one another. Now, you probably are asking, well, Jack, what are you doing with your hat on? You're not supposed to wear a hat in the house. Well, may I simply say that when you get to be 93 years old, your eyes get a little photogenic or whatever, and you can't see too well, and so you wear a hat. But also, since as an investigator, explorer, sort of a detective, well, you got to know that we always work undercover. And not only that, but we have a bloodhound with us, which kind of helps us out. We have a certified Allegheny bloodhound here. Okay, now let's get into the scriptures. There are storms in life, storms in the life of most every Christian. Two kinds of storms: literal storm and a metaphorical or figurative storm. But in any case, it's a situation where a person is simply overwhelmed. Example of literal storm: flooding. Flooding rooms comes into the house, the water's 2 feet high in the living room, carpet is ruined. That's overwhelming. That's a storm. Or the hurricane comes and puts most of the trees through the roof into the house. That's a storm. Well, now, a figurative or a metaphorical storm might be you're sitting at the kitchen table paying your bills, and you have $19 in the bank, and the stack of bills in front of you comes to $437.24. That's overwhelming. That's a storm. Another storm, as you're sitting there working with paying the bills, the telephone rings. Hello, this is the doctor's office. We've just gone over your blood work, and we've determined that you have a life-threatening disease. That's a storm, an overwhelming storm. Storms like this come into every Christian's life, or most every Christian's life. You know, the saying is, into each life a little rain must fall. Wow, that is the understatement of the year. What an understatement. A little rain? We are most likely to experience in our Christian life 2 or 3 or 4 major storms. And there'll be storms in almost every Christian life to bring a sense of absolute being overwhelmed. Hey, is that normal? Well, let's take a look and see. Storms. Vital spiritual lessons, can be learned in a storm. You'll grow as a Christian in a storm. We have lived here in North Carolina under the shadow of hurricanes. And about 2 years ago was a record-breaking hurricane. Florence was her name. She flooded a good part of southeastern North Carolina. The nickname for Florence is Flo. And that's a wonderful way to designate what happened, because most part of the state come under deep water. The water really, really, really flowed. Now, in the old days, they didn't keep records. We don't know, maybe 200, 300 years ago or before, there were record-breaking storms. We don't have a record of them. Yet, on the other hand, we do have some reports of what must be kind of record-breaking storms from the year 800 before Christ, and then again in the 1st century. You yourself can give maybe a rather vivid description of the overwhelmingness of a storm in your life, but let's go with what we see in the Bible. You know, it's great to know that the Lord of the storm stands with you when you're overwhelmed. Take a look at the storm reports that you have, for example, in the book of Jonah. Jonah experienced quite a storm, you'll recall. He had been called by God to go to Nineveh and to preach, and he turned around, bought a ship ticket in Joppa, and went the other direction in the Mediterranean Sea. A huge storm arises, and Jonah is with the crew and with the people on the ship, and they finally determine after several days the real problem, because Jonah made a confession, was Jonah. So Jonah agreed to be thrown overboard to appease the God. Well, he was thrown overboard, and God had prepared a dam gadol, that's Hebrew for a great fish, to swallow him up, which he did. God took him through the storm. God held him in the tummy of that great fish, and the great fish somehow came up onto the beach north of Joppa, closer to Nineveh, and had a Malibu belly burp, and burped up Jonah, and Jonah comes onto the beach, pretty much a changed man. He says, "Which way to Nineveh?" He turned around. And you know, sometimes a storm will come into your life to turn you around. Jonah eventually found himself where he was supposed to be, in Nineveh, and he went to work doing God's will. Jonah chapter 2, verse 10 to Jonah chapter 3, verse 3 kind of summarize the whole thing. Let me read that for you. So the Lord spoke to the fish, and he vomited Jonah on the dry land. Now the word of the Lord to Jonah the second time came, "Arise, go to Nineveh, that city, and preach to it the message I tell you." So Jonah arose and went to Nineveh, according to the word of the Lord. Now Nineveh was an exceeding great city, a 3 days' journey in extent. Jonah was a changed man because of the storm. Now, let's scoot up over to the 1st century and see Jesus and his disciples on the hillside, where Jesus has been teaching in parables. He's done teaching, it's towards evening, and so he says, "Men, get into the boat," and he himself got into the boat. May I read for you Mark chapter 4, verses 35 to 41. On the same day, when evening had come, he said to them, "Let us cross over to the other side." Now when they had left the multitude, they took him along in the boat as he was, and other little boats were also with him. And a great windstorm arose, and the waves beat into the boat, so that it was already filling. But he was in the stern, asleep on a pillow. And they awoke him and said to him, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" He'd been teaching parables, and now it's time to teach with an experience. He and his men were in the boat in a terrible, terrible storm. and they were terrified, absolutely terrified. You know, Galilee is an inland sea, 13 miles long, 8 miles wide, but another dimension, 700 feet below sea level. So, and on each side of the inland sea, or we might even call it an overgrown lake, there was a range of high hills which made Galilee into a perfect wind tunnel. And the storms there were magnificent. Back in the 1950s was a beautiful piece of music we used to love to hear sung called Master, the tempest is raging. May I read the first verse and the refrain, the chorus? Master, the tempest is raging, the billows are tossing high, the sky is o'ershadowed with blackness, no shelter or help is nigh. Carest thou not that we perish? How canst thou lie asleep, when each moment so madly is threatening a grave in the stormy deep? And then the refrain, the winds and the rain shall obey thy will. Peace, be still. Whether the wrath of the storm-tossed sea, or demons or men, or whatever it be, no waters can swallow the ship where lies the Master of ocean and earth and skies. They all shall sweetly obey thy will. Peace, be still. Peace, be still. They all shall sweetly obey thy will. Peace, peace, be still. Now notice this, please. So often when we Christians come into overwhelming experiences in our life, we may tend to think God has abandoned us. As the fisherman cried out, Master, carest thou not that we perish? And we think, maybe, what have I done wrong, Lord? Notice that these men were exactly spot on, dead in the middle of God's will, because Jesus told them, get into the boat, men. So the 12 got into the boat. Then Jesus himself got into the boat. Were these men in the will of God? Oh, absolutely. The faithful Christian life can be full of overwhelming storms. James chapter 1, verses 2 and 3. Brethren, count it all joy when you come into various temptations and trials, knowing that the testing of your faith brings forth patience. Jesus, the Lord of the storm, is in the boat with you, and that experience will change your life. Going through that storm, there is a reason for every storm. He says, peace, be still, and the waves subside, and all is calm. Now, he wants you to know that he is with you in the storm. Storm or no storm, you reach your destination, which is to fulfill God's will in your life. Have peace. Be at peace. In the blasting storm, be at peace in the quietness of the midnight. Well, all right, there's another storm that comes there in that first century. It's called a Euroclydine. And the Apostle Paul was caught in that storm. There's some background, maybe. that I should give you. Remember, Paul was just coming back from the third missionary journey. He had heavy on his heart the desire to go to Rome and preach the gospel in Rome. And so he feels, however, he must go to Jerusalem first and then to Rome. So he takes some friends, including Trophimus, a Gentile, Titus and Trophimus. Trophimus is a Gentile, and he went with Paul into the court of the Gentiles where he was allowed to be. But there was a rumor. Trophimus went beyond with Paul, beyond the court of the Gentiles. Bottom line, there was a great disturbance in the temple, and they're out to get Paul and put him to death, and he's rescued by the Roman soldiers. And that night he winds up in a Roman confinement. Well, this is no way to go to Rome, but Jesus comes to him, according to Acts 23, verse 11. And he says to his Paul simply, so that now, Paul, thou shalt bear witness to me at Rome. Jesus promises no matter what happens, no storm, no shipwreck, nothing can take away the fact that you, Paul, are going to Rome to tell them more about me and the gospel. So they're in the storm. The Euroclydon has come down, and for a week or two they've been back and forth, and the ship is rocking and reeling, and they frap the ship. They throw a line around just to hold the ship together. They throw the cargo of wheat away. It was a wheat cargo ship. There are about 250 or 260 men aboard. The crew, Paul, the Roman commander, and Roman prisoners. Wow, it was a terrible, frightening storm. And then they see land. And they navigated into a cove in the land. It was Malta. And the waves kept pounding until the ship began to come to pieces as if terrible waves. By the way, we're talking about record-breaking storms. I meant to mention that on Galilee, well, on the Florence that we had here in North Carolina 2 years ago, the waves were clocked at 35 feet high. Now, I watched a picture on the video on YouTube on the computer of a storm on Galilee. And they measured waves on Galilee 30 feet high on that inland sea. And in this video, you could even see the swell as though it was an ocean storm. The swell of the waves and white caps everywhere. But Jesus said, Paul, you're going to go to Rome. And the ship was destroyed, but all lives were saved. And Paul finds himself on the way to Rome eventually. The storm that you're in now, the solution, the stilling of the storm, it may come by tonight. It may come by tomorrow. It may come in a week or so. It may never come in this lifetime. But I tell you, however long that storm lasts, God will take you through it. Jesus will be with you. And you will arrive on that golden shore with the assurance God has fulfilled his will in my life. There is an end to the stormy journey at the Father's house of life, of love, and may I say, of dry land. Years ago, on a radio program, I heard a poem read about the Apostle Paul in a storm, and I've tried and tried and tried to find that poem, but it's been lost somehow. Even the religious people that put the program on said, we can't find the poem, sorry. But I remember 3 little lines out of that poem, if I may, please. Now do remember that Paul is going to Rome, and Rome was a Latin-speaking area, which eventually became an Italian-speaking era. So there's a little bit of an Italian accent here. One line, there's a man. He's tall. He's not a shorta, he's a Paul. Then another line, the ship, she's a rocka, and the ship, she's a roller. Oh, and then it concludes with these words of reassurance. We get to Jerusalem by and by. Now, of course, in this case, we're talking about Paul going to Rome. But whatever storm there is in your life, you'll get to the, quote, Rome that God has put into your life to fulfill his purposes. Storm survivors make great, strong Christians. God will bring you through every Euroclydon. God will bring you through every snake bite. God will bring you through every lashing that Paul had, and you may have. God will bring you through every whipping that Paul had, and that you may have. Even lifetime disease, even terminal illness. Paul can tell you about that. He came through a lifetime affliction in his life. We're not sure whether he was a spastic or whether his eyes were bad, but it even affected his looks, if we understand the book of Galatians correctly. And he said, 2 Corinthians 12, I asked the Lord 3 times, take this away from me. And the Lord said, no, Paul, this is going to be a lifetime thing in your life. But I just want you to know that the grace of God is all you really need, and all that you really have. There may be shipwreck along the way. There may be a death of your dreams. There may be a death of your body. But stay with Jesus in the boat. Stay the course. Know Jesus is in the boat, and you'll arrive at God's goal, God's purposes for your life. Well, then the question becomes, if you're listening or watching, the question becomes, is Jesus in your boat? Is Jesus in your boat with you? He's waiting to hear you say, Lord Jesus, come aboard my boat. Come into my life today. John 1:12, for as many as received him, to them gave he the power to become the children of God, to those who believe on his name. Jesus is the Lord of the storms.